Hello, so this is the second in my series of religious studies, ethics, philosophy, A-level talks. And again, I'm going to aim to talk for about 20 minutes. Now, this is just an introduction. Normally when I'm teaching, I would do a second lesson going into a little bit more depth about the ontological argument. This is probably, I have to confess, this is the topic in the religious studies, the philosophy section of the A-level that most animates me. It's the thing I most enjoy. I can say now, probably without spoiling, without this being a spoiler, that I don't entirely think the ontological argument works. On the other hand, I do think it is spectacular. So let's break into this. And to do so, I'd like you to think of a man, Bertrand Russell. In fact, if you want to do some extra research, you should look up not only Bertrand Russell, but you should also look up a man called Kurt Gödel, who's a great mathematician. We might have a bit of time for him, but I would normally put him into the second lesson. Bertrand Russell, that great atheist really, there's a story about him walking across the quadrangle of his college in Cambridge. And as he crossed the grass, because of course dons could walk across the grass, no one else can, he thought that the ontological argument might work. Great God in boots, he's supposed to have said, the ontological argument works. By the time he got to the other side of the quadrangle, he realized it didn't. Now, what does that tell us? That tells us how significant this argument is. So whether we think it works or whether we think it doesn't work, great minds, even into the 20th, or certainly the 20th century, have thought that it might. It's also your introduction to abstract philosophical thought. And this is why we look at it, and this is why we give it so much attention. We've got to approach this very, very methodically, and there's lots and lots of words that you've got to be introduced to. So first of all, we have to look at the philosophical principles behind this argument, behind the argument of Anselm, really. I'm going to flash them up very quickly on the board behind me. If you don't know what they are, you need to look them up. I'm only going to give you sort of cursory explanations because there isn't really very much time. If you want more detail, I'm very happy to go into more detail in the next class. Second point, we need to have a look at Anselm himself. I have a few tricks, I think, which make this a lot easier, but it does involve a little bit of memory work and learning one definition in Latin, which I think you will stick with you for the rest of your life, and it will be well worth it. It's well worth spending half an hour learning that definition. And finally, we need to look at some of the criticisms, or at least one of the major criticisms of the ontological argument, first advanced really by Gaunillo, and then reworked by Kant. So to look at these definitions, the first one and the most important one is a priori. What is an a priori or a priori argument? It's a logical deduction. It's not based on sense experience. It's a priori, prior to experience. And the opposite is an a posteriori, an argument which is a posteriori, post the experience. Second definition is inductive. You know what deductive is. Inductive. Inductive is probably true. Deductive is certainly true. So we use these words very loosely and often in the wrong places. Something which is deductive is about logic. It's not in fact, for the most part, about Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes uses this term deduction as a way to strengthen his argument. It's not in fact what he's doing. He's not really using logic. He's using induction. Deduction. If you have a premise, if you have two premises, then the conclusion must be true. If the premise is true, the conclusion is true. That is deduction. Very simple. And we're thinking, we have to start with a premise. Well, let's say, if God is the greatest maximal being, that might be your premise. It is definitely Anselm's premise. It follows from that the conclusion is God exists. We'll come to this. We have to look at a few other definitions. What is a necessary and what is a contingent being? Well, think instead of necessary truth. A necessary truth is something that cannot possibly be false. So a necessary being is someone who cannot possibly not exist. Most things in the universe are contingent. I can imagine something not existing. I can imagine me, sadly, not existing. I can imagine you. I can't even see you. I can imagine you not existing. Isn't that entertaining? I could imagine, actually, the world not existing. Harder, but there was a time before the world was created when it did not exist. We can, in fact, imagine that. Therefore, we can imagine the world not existing. The world, in other words, is a contingent thing. Very important. Then we have grammar. And grammar is always a problem. But in grammar, remember, for most verbs, you have a verb and an object, a subject and an object. I like apples. I like cheddar cheese. That's probably a better one. That's truer. I am the subject of that sentence, like is the verb, and cheddar cheese is the object. However, if I use the verb to be, the two nouns become slightly different. In fact, we can swap them over. We can sound a bit like Yoda without changing the essential sense. So I could say, I am Tim. And then we could reverse that. Tim, I am. I can think of a rap singer that reminds me of that. So what is Tim in that sentence? I is the subject, am, the verb to be, is the verb, and Tim is the predicate. Okay, that is an essential idea. The predicate tells us about the subject. And the final definition that we need to be aware of in order to look at this topic is the distinction between what is synthetic and what is analytic. Difficult one, this one. Something which is analytic is about a definition. It's about the meaning of words. Something which is synthetic is a statement which you would use to talk about experience. So, for example, a synthetic statement might be, the rose is red. There are many roses. This rose is red. The rose is red. But if I were to say, the rose is a flower, that is an analytic statement. It's a definition. Now, the ontological argument itself, I'm sorry, I've sort of finished the definitions there, and you'll need to bear these in mind. So if you haven't taken notes, do, because you need to have these things in front of you as we progress. The second sort of part of our talk is about Anselm himself and what he's doing. And he's presenting a thing called the ontological argument. And here you need a little bit of Greek. The word ontos is the word being. So ontological is the study of being. Anselm, Saint Anselm, was an 11th century archbishop. And he lived from 1033 to 1109. And he wanted to establish the existence of God. No, he didn't. He didn't think for one moment that God was in any doubt. He did not doubt the existence of God. Gaunillo did not doubt the existence of God. Kant did not doubt the existence of God. So do get this right. What the people who criticize Anselm are doubting is whether or not his argument is sound. Okay? So very, very important. Do not question their faith. That's for them, not for you. Now, Anselm wanted to define God in a non-biblical way. Anselm wanted to define God philosophically. The God of the philosophers goes all the way back to before Plato. We may look at this a little bit later. Anselm defined God with a little Latin tag, and I would like you, if you want to write really good essays, I would like you to learn this Latin tag, because it's so much easier than using the English translation, where you start to get into such confusion about what is what. But if you can drop into Latin just for this tag, it helps, I promise. Anselm's Latin tag is that God is id quo nihil maius cogitare potest. Id quo, that which, nihil, nothing, maius, greater, cogitare, to think, cogitare potest, it is possible. Nothing greater is possible to be thought. God is that than which nothing greater can be imagined. Okay? Id quo nihil maius cogitare potest. Anselm's argument is a priori and deductive. God, that's the subject, exists. That's the predicate. Or God is existing. That would be existing is the predicate. It's a necessary truth and a necessary being. The definition of God is analytically true. Faith and reason, in this particular instance, are in harmony. Now, what does Anselm say? Anselm says that God is great. And one of the attributes of greatness is omniscience, or omnipotence, or benevolence. Now, if we have this definition that nothing can be greater than God, and that God is that than which nothing is greater, it is not possible to think of anything greater, then it would actually be stupid to say that God does not exist. That's actually his starting point. His starting point is a psalm from the Bible. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. Simply to use the word God is to say something which is illogical. You cannot say there is no being with Anselm's definition. Because whatever being you think is the greatest, you must call God. So to say there is no God is nonsensical. Now, he then comes back and he's got three arguments really. So his first argument, or the first part of the argument, is the definition. The second part is really the idea that the fool says in his heart there is no God. And the third part is that a non-existent God is less effective than an existent God. Oh, this is all getting terribly abstract now, isn't it? But imagine if we were in a school in the 19th century where teachers used to hit children. What a horrible idea. Actually, it used to happen in my school when I was at school in the 1960s. So I think I was the only boy in my school who was not beaten. There was actually a man who was employed to beat children. What a horrible thought. Anyway, the threat of being beaten is not as painful as the actual beating. So to say you will be beaten, that's not as bad as actually doing it. To say there is a God is not as great as actually there being a God. So a non-existent God, a God of fantasy, is not as great as an existing God. Let's go back to our definition. If our definition is that God is a fantasy, a non-existent being, God is defined by Anselm as id quo nihil maius cogitari potest, that than which nothing is greater. But we've just said that a non-existent thing is not as great as an existing thing. Therefore, Anselm says, the non-existing God is not as great as an existing God. God must be the greatest, therefore the existing God is greater than the non-existing God, therefore God exists. It's rather entertaining. Now, there's another monk called Gaunillo. We know absolutely nothing about him as far as I believe. Every so often I think we do know something about Gaunillo, but I really think we know nothing. Gaunillo only exists to contradict Anselm. Gaunillo speaks out for the fool. Gaunillo defends the position of the fool. Now, he's not saying that God does not exist. He's saying that Anselm's argument must be flawed. And actually, the argument he gives, with some modifications, is the main criticism of the ontological argument which you are going to advance. He says, he draws the image of a perfect island. Well, if I want to have a perfect island, if I define a perfect island, then that island must exist if it's to be perfect. So I'm sort of defining something into existence. I'm taking words, de dicto, and I'm turning them into reality, de re. And what Gaunillo says, and what later Kant will say, is you can't go from de dicto to de re. You can't go from words to reality. Simply because something looks good on paper doesn't mean it actually exists. You know this from those times when you write what you think is a really brilliant essay, you hand it in, and the next day you are told it's awful. It looks good on words, but it's not that good in reality. You cannot define something into existence. What Gaunillo says is that this is exactly what Anselm has tried to do. And he uses the island as a reductio ad absurdum. He takes Anselm's logical argument to an absurd level. We might say, actually today, that simply because I can define what a fairy is, fairies exist. Simply because I can define what a unicorn is, which I much prefer, simply because I can define what a unicorn is, unicorns must exist. Actually, we all have an understanding of what a unicorn is. And I could tell you, Darth Vader, simply because we all share an opinion about Darth Vader. We can even do the theme tune. Darth Vader must exist. Complete rot. Now, the next point is how Anselm responds to this. Because Anselm says, well, the island and God are two completely different types of being. So do you remember our definitions at the beginning? Contingent and necessary. God, says Anselm, is a necessary being. But the island is contingent. This makes perfect sense. When you think of an island, how would you define an island? You can't define an island by itself. An island is actually defined by the sea that surrounds it. Without the sea, the island would not exist. God, on the other hand, could exist with nothing else. An island, says Alvin Plantinga. There's a picture of Alvin Plantinga. He's going to be one of your friends. He turns up a lot in this subject. Alvin Plantinga says an island can always be better. I can think of a perfect island with 100 trees. Ooh, I could think of an even more perfect island with 1,000 trees, and maybe a little hut, or a koala bear. God, on the other hand, in contrast, is maximally great. You cannot think of a better God. God is an absolute, id quod nihil maius, cogitare potest. It's not for nothing that Anselm has defined God in the negative. Okay, so that's the second point. God has necessary existence, unlike the island, unlike the unicorn, unlike Darth Vader and Mary Poppins. God has necessary existence. And the second part of Anselm's response in Proslogion 4, God cannot be thought not to exist. God exists in understanding and in reality. The greatest possible being implies his own existence. Now, if you say that, if you define God as the greatest possible being, actually that word alone implies existence, doesn't it? Being. So God is defined by Anselm as a necessary being, and it is an analytic statement. Now, Anselm is not alone in approaching or giving us a version of the ontological argument. He is the main person that you're going to refer to. There are others. They don't always fall today in the A-level syllabus, but they're worth looking at. So I'm just going to touch on them. The most important is a man called Descartes, and Descartes was actually also writing in Latin. He wrote a book called the Meditations, and in the Meditations, Descartes defines God as a supremely perfect being. If he is supremely perfect, he must have all the attributes of perfection. God is the most perfect being, so he has all perfection. And one of the things that you would have to have if you were perfect would be existence. Existence is a perfection. It's no good being the most perfect cook if you don't actually exist. Existence is a necessary part of God. If we think of a triangle, says Descartes, it has to have 3 angles. If you think of God, he has to exist. Another person who I think is worth looking at, if you have time, is Kurt Gödel. And he approaches the idea mathematically. His proof was printed after his death. And he defines God as having every positive property. If you're looking at criticisms, which we're going to do in a few seconds, it's worth having a look at the ideas of Douglas Gasking. I've been championing this idea for about 20 years, I think. Douglas Gasking gives you a sort of non-ontological, an ontological non-argument where he talks about the non-existence of God being necessary. Now, the strengths of the ontological argument. The most important strength is this logical idea. God exists necessarily because that is how we define God. What can we say about that? Your best conclusion, if you want a potted conclusion, an oven-ready conclusion, is if there is a God, then he exists. If you believe in God, then he exists. It is deductive. If it works, it is a proof. It is a proof in a way that actually all the other arguments for the existence of God are not quite proofs. This one, because it is logical, is actually a proof. Karl Barth slightly dilutes it a bit, and he says that it is a confession of faith. It's fine. I don't think Anselm would disagree, actually. In fact, if you read the Proslogion, it starts off rather like a prayer. The third thing, which I think is the third great strength of the ontological argument, is that it is your first introduction to abstract thought. If we agree that the ontological argument works, it is stronger than the teleological argument because it is a proof. It is also a confession of faith, number 2, and number 3, it is your first introduction to abstract thought. We're going to finish by looking very briefly at the weaknesses or the criticisms, and we're going to concentrate only on Immanuel Kant, who looked like this. To posit a triangle and reject its 3 angles, he says, is self-contradictory. But there is no contradiction in rejecting the triangle together with its 3 angles. Yes, 3 angles. So to define God in an analytic way does not necessarily make it real. So we can define a unicorn, we can define Darth Vader, we can define Mary Poppins, but that does not make them real. What Kant says is there is a distinction between a logical and a real predicate. Remember the definitions at the beginning. You need this word, predicate. We cannot define something into existence. We can say what something is, that is a logical definition. We can say what something is, but we need something extra to make it real. That's Kant's position. Kant later is challenged by Hegel. Now, if you want to do some research, I strongly recommend you look up the work of Elizabeth Anscombe. You might look up a wonderful Oxford philosopher. Well, Anscombe also was an Oxford philosopher. Iris Murdoch. And they certainly sort of develop ideas linking to the ontological argument. It's also very important to look up Norman Malcolm, who in the 1960s emphasized the sort of second definition of the ontological argument that was advanced by Anselm in response to Gaunillo's criticism. So that really, I think we've taken up about 20 minutes, but that is about as far as I can go in this first treatment on the ontological argument. You really need to do a little bit of extra reading if you're going to score highly in an essay on the ontological argument. But you need to start with those definitions. And I would say the best thing you can possibly do if you're at the beginning of your lower 6 studies, or if you're approaching this for the first time, is sit down and spend half an hour just learning that Latin tag. Id quo nihil maius cogitare potest. One of the ways, of course, to remember that is to think of the wonderful word nihilism, from nihil, meaning nothing. Okay, so for now, this is Tim, and thank you very much for coming here. I will go on to something else in the next lesson. Bye-bye.